is to declare a recess at any time. Good afternoon. I want to welcome all of our witnesses and express my appreciation for your attendance and certainly for your testimony today. Today's hearing will explore concerns and complaints about transparency and accountability at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Just about a year ago, we had a similar hearing where the administrator obviously testified, and in reviewing some of the transcripts, I was reminded of some of the moments in that where the communication between you and members of this committee was, I guess, less than clear. And so we posed some questions that seemed very forthright to us, but seem maybe to be confused. And so obviously this follow-up hearing hopefully will provide some clarity as we look at that. For example, can you send a list of either proposed rules or other rules that are undergoing the informal review process? And the administrator said, well, I don't know, what are you referring to? So of course I was referring to the same process that the GAO has referred to as an informal review, at least as early as 2003, which is the time prior to the agency's formal submission of a rule to OIRA, during which OIRA frequently has had a significant influence over the development of the rule. So this year we wanted to bring back in some of the experts, including a regulatory expert from GAO, to help us maybe wade through some of this messy process and possibly help us bridge the communication gap that may have resulted from my inability to articulate exactly what we were looking for. GAO and regulatory experts have been calling for greater transparency and accountability from OIRA for more than a decade. In fact, in 2003, GAO issued a report that provided significant details on how OIRA's review process could be addressed, but also raised several concerns about transparency and accountability. And since then, GAO has issued reports and recommendations on how agencies and OIRA identify significant regulations and how they explain the cost-benefit analysis and improve retrospective regulatory reviews. By my count, there are about 17 open recommendations that OIRA has not yet addressed and that would improve the federal regulatory process. Instead, OIRA is marred by consistently late reporting, incomplete analysis, poor data quality, and insufficient oversight of the federal regulatory process. OIRA is quite possibly an agency overwhelmed by this responsibility and insufficient resources, but the public doesn't know because of OIRA's failed to provide any insight into that process. So hopefully we'll be able to hear some on that today. In the past year, the committee has experienced a frustration of the secretive regulatory process at OIRA firsthand. I want to emphasize that I use the word frustration, and I could use something much more definitive in terms of making that analysis. During last year's hearing, several subcommittee members, myself included, requested that the administrator provide documentation on how OIRA conducted its reviews as it relates to the waters of the USA rulemaking. This type of request is something that we would ask of any agency so that the committee can conduct its oversight responsibilities effectively. In general, agencies provide the committee with the information it needs to understand what happened and why. Some agencies take longer than others, but generally we receive the information in a relatively reasonable period of time. Our experience with OIRA, however, has been different. And in the past year, we've experienced an unprecedented effort, in our opinion, to obstruct the committee's oversight abilities and restrict access to information about the federal regulatory process. OIRA's resistance to complying with the committee's simple request raises more concerns than we had last year. Persistent requests for transparencies and assistance with oversight from the public and now from Congress are apparently met with disregard from OIRA. This committee may need to look into other means to ensure that the agency is an effective regulatory gatekeeper and accountable to the taxpayers. And while the committee's investigation into OIRA's review of the WOTUS rulemaking is ongoing, it is really not the focus of this hearing. The committee wanted to hold this hearing to explore policy concerns and maybe options, Administrator, to address those concerns. And so today we ask our witnesses both where additional transparency and accountability at OIRA are needed, as well as what legislative efforts that the committee should consider to spread a little sunshine into the secretive, deliberative process of the agency. And do you think that putting OIRA's regulatory review function into a statute would help OIRA better understand its obligations to Congress and the American people? Or is OIRA overburdened with the numerous obligations that you have? Does OIRA need more staff to conduct a more thorough review of the regulatory actions and meet its current obligations for transparency? We just want to know how this committee can help crack OIRA open for public review and purview, and Congress to better understand the important work that this agency does. So any thoughts or suggestions that the witnesses can offer us would be very helpful. And with that, I would now like to recognize my good friend, Mr. Conley, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Government Operations, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm sorry for the delay. I was detained on the floor after votes. And thanks for holding another hearing on what is arguably one of the most influential and consequential federal agencies that most Americans have never heard of. This relatively small and mostly anonymous office reviews and coordinates the issuance of vital federal regulations that have an impact on our nation's economy, environment, public health, and safety. A year ago, Mr. Chairman, this subcommittee gathered to discuss the challenges facing the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, or OIRA. We reviewed the Government Accountability Office's recommendations and examined ways to make the regulatory review process more efficient and transparent. We reconvened today to check on the Office's compliance and progress. OIRA plays a key role in shaping hundreds of important rules, such as those that safeguard food supply, guarantee buildings are accessible for the disabled, promote public safety, and protect the quality of our drinking water, about which we had a hearing this morning and into the afternoon. And we'll have another one Thursday. Despite the powerful impact this agency has on the lives of all Americans, OIRA operates mostly in the shadows. And from a good government point of view, greater transparency might be warranted. Unfortunately, there continues to be a documented lack of transparency within this small statutory office housed within the Office of Management and Budget. Over the years, GAO has repeatedly found that OIRA, under multiple administrations, has failed to meet the transparency requirements contained in the relevant executive orders that prescribe the principles and procedures OIRA should follow when conducting regulatory review. In last year's hearing, I mentioned GAO's recommendations issued in 2003 to address transparency challenges. GAO followed up with a report in 2009, again noting transparency issues and providing additional recommendations. To date, OIRA appears to have implemented only 9 of those 25 identified recommendations. And obviously today we're going to hear from Mr. Shalansky about that progress or lack thereof. Furthermore, I believe the public and OIRA would be best served if it provided guidance to agencies to ensure that they consistently report changes suggested by OIRA in the rulemaking dockets, disclose information about all outside parties it meets with regarding rulemaking, and ensure that the informal rulemaking reviews, which are in place to streamline and verify the process, are not misused to reduce the very transparency we are seeking. Congress and the American people have a right to know why some rules sit under OIRA review for years, when the review process is supposed to be 90 days. There are currently 31 regulatory actions that have been under OIRA review for more than 90 days, some considerably more. In closing, I also do want to recognize that OIRA has an incredibly difficult challenge and a hardworking and dedicated core of career staff that's providing first-rate quantitative analysis weighing complex economic costs against potential benefits. And somebody's got to do that, because sometimes we have rhetoric up here that presupposes all regulation is bad and none of it ever has any positive externalities, and that's flat out untrue, and experience tells us that. So to have an independent agency that's doing that codification, doing that kind of analysis is critical. But as the chairman indicated, and I certainly support, but transparency, in order to have validation, in order to have credibility, there has to be transparency. And so I thank the chair for having another hearing on this matter, and I welcome our panelists and look forward to the testimony.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia. I would also like to make note that we'll hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any other members who would like to submit a written statement. We'll now recognize our panel of witnesses, and I'm pleased to welcome the Honorable Howard Shelanski, Administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at the Office of OMB, Ms. Michelle Sager, Director of Strategic Issues at the Government Accountability Office, Mr. Richard Williams, Vice President of Policy Research and Director of Regulatory Studies Programs at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and Mr. Sam Batkins, is that correct? Batkins, Director of Regulatory Policy at the American Action Forum. Welcome to you all, and pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify, so I'd like to ask you to rise. Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Please be seated and let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative, and in order to allow time for discussion, please limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes, but your entire written statement will be made part of the record. And Mr. Shelanski, we will recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to discuss the role that the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, plays in the federal regulatory process. Regulatory process in the United States is premised to an unrivaled degree on 2 principles: transparency and accountability. One of my priorities at OIRA has been to increase the transparency of the regulatory process by improving notice and predictability for the public. During my tenure, we have timely published each spring and fall the Unified Agenda and Regulatory Plan, which shows agency rulemaking activity for the year that follows. To further promote transparency, OIRA maintains a rigorous process when it comes to the review of individual regulations. First and foremost, OIRA consistently upholds the established standards that draft rules and their accompanying analyses must meet under applicable executive orders, statutes, and published guidance. While OIRA takes the time necessary to ensure thorough interagency review of regulations, we are mindful that unnecessary delays in the publication of rules are potentially harmful across the board. Harmful to stakeholders wishing to comment on proposed rules, to businesses and other entities that must make plans to comply with rules, and to parties denied the benefits of regulation. Under the Administrative Procedure Act, agencies must generally provide the public with an opportunity to comment on proposed rules before the agency can finalize those rules. OIRA plays an important role in this process by ensuring that agencies' regulatory proposals contain sufficient detail, explanation, and underlying analysis for the public to provide meaningful comments and response. Such transparency is essential to the public's ability to influence the regulations with which they must eventually live. Once an agency drafts the final rule for publication, OIRA again plays an important role by ensuring that the agency takes account of the public comments on the earlier proposal, that the final rule logically follows from the proposed rule and those public comments, and that the agency's final rule is well-grounded in the record evidence and meets applicable economic analytical requirements. Such accountability is essential to ensuring that agencies heed public comment and issue rules that are effective and efficient. As the discussion above implies, when an agency submits a draft final or proposed rule to OIRA, the rule is not yet finished and may change during the review period. OIRA circulates the rule to other federal offices and agencies for comment and examines the rule for the quality of its underlying evidence and analysis. OIRA then transmits the comments from other federal agencies, as well as its own comments on the rule, back to the rulemaking agency. Once this process is concluded, OIRA concludes review and the rule goes back to the agency for publication in the Federal Register. The executive orders require the agency, upon request, to make publicly available both the version of the rule the agency originally submitted to OIRA, as well as the final published version, so that the public can see any changes that occurred during interagency review. To further ensure accountability and transparency in the regulatory review process, when an agency submits a rule to OIRA, the submission appears publicly the next day on OIRA's website, reginfo.gov. Stakeholders, therefore, have noticed that OIRA is initiating review. This notice is important because, pursuant to Executive Order 12866, OIRA meets with any party interested in providing input on a regulation under review. The entities with which OIRA typically meets include state and local governments, businesses, trade associations, unions, and advocates from environmental health and safety organizations. OIRA posts a searchable log of all such meetings on its website, and that log now includes both meetings that have already taken place and also upcoming meetings. The Regulatory Right to Know Act, which calls for OMB to submit to Congress each year an accounting statement and associated report, promotes additional accountability. This report includes an estimate of the total annual benefits and costs of federal rules and paperwork in the aggregate, by agency and agency program, and by major rule. OIRA issued its final 2015 report on the costs and benefits of federal regulations earlier this month. Finally, a hallmark of this administration's commitment to transparency and accountability is our retrospective review effort. Agencies submit reports on the status of their retrospective review efforts every 6 months. Agencies release their most recent reports on March 4th and will submit their next set to OIRA this summer. The agency's regulatory look-back efforts to date are expected to yield an estimated net 5-year savings of $28 billion so far. In conclusion, the United States has perhaps the most transparent and accountable regulatory system in the world. OIRA's review of executive branch regulations plays an important role in that system. OIRA will therefore continue its efforts to remain accessible to the public during regulatory review, to work with agencies to provide the public with notice of planned regulatory activities, and to ensure that the government regulates as effectively and efficiently as possible to the net benefit of all Americans. Thank you for your time and attention. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Sager. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Connolly, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today to discuss GAO's work. We have consistently found opportunities to improve regulatory transparency, and I am honored to represent GAO and share a selection of our findings. My written statement provides additional detail as well as references to the multiple reports that inform my remarks today. In the next few minutes, I will highlight findings from recent reports with a focus on, first, aspects of the regulatory review process that could be more transparent, and second, additional opportunities to enhance transparency and oversight of the rulemaking process. First, our reports on cost-benefit analysis, rule development, and OMB's role in reviews of agencies' rules illustrate specific opportunities to increase the transparency of the regulatory review process. For example, with regard to cost-benefit analysis, our 2014 report found that reviews of agencies' rules sometimes did result in changes, but the transparency of the review process could be improved. In that report, we made 3 recommendations to OMB. First, that OMB work with agencies to clearly communicate the reasons for designating significant regulations and explain the reason for any changes to an agency's initial assessment of a regulation's significance. And second, we recommended that OMB encourage agencies to state in the preamble section of the executive order definition of a significant regulatory action that applies to that particular regulation. OMB implemented the first recommendation in that report. Second, additional opportunities do exist to enhance transparency and congressional oversight of the rulemaking process. OMB plays a very important role in this process through oversight and by providing guidance to agencies on how they should comply with the various requirements. GAO reports covering a range of topics such as regulatory guidance, retrospective regulatory review, and exceptions for expediting the rulemaking process illustrate additional opportunities to enhance transparency. So, for example, retrospective analysis can help agencies evaluate how well existing regulations work in practice and also determine whether they should be modified or perhaps even repealed. In a 2014 report, we found that agencies often did change their regulations in response to completed retrospective analyses, but they could improve reporting on their progress and also strengthen linkages between their retrospective review and agencies' performance goals. We also concluded that OMB could enhance transparency of the information provided to the public. We made 3 recommendations in this report. First, that OMB improve reporting on retrospective regulatory review outcomes. Second, to improve how these reviews could be used to help agencies achieve their agency priority goals. And third, to ensure that OIRA monitor the extent to which agencies have implemented guidance on these reviews, and then confirm that agencies have identified how they would assess the performance of regulations in the future. Staff from OIRA generally agreed with these 3 recommendations, and last year the administrator indicated that the agency was indeed taking actions to address them. In summary, as you see in my written statement, OIRA has implemented 9 of the 25 recommendations in the selected reports outlined in the written statement. We believe that the other 16 related recommendations that have not been implemented still have merit, and if acted upon, would improve the transparency of federal rulemaking. In a step in that direction, last year the administrator noted that OIRA has worked with agencies to help them with their executive order disclosure requirements. Increased transparency of the rulemaking process holds potential benefits for your continued oversight, as well as for increased public awareness and understanding of the rulemaking process for the regulations that affect all of us as citizens and as taxpayers. Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Connolly, members of the subcommittee, this concludes my prepared statement. I look forward to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sager. Dr. Williams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Connolly, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I want to offer my perspective as someone who has worked both at OIRA, briefly, and at an agency, the FDA. I know how difficult it is for economists at agencies to produce high-quality, unbiased analysis, but also how difficult the job OIRA analysts have of ensuring that regulations are solidly grounded in good analysis. When they are so grounded, regulations address real problems, actually help to solve those problems, and with reasonable costs. Good analysis helps the public to understand the likely effects of regulation, i.e., make them transparent. But the job for OIRA analysts is becoming much more difficult because of the growing imbalance between OIRA and the agencies they're expected to regulate. While federal agencies have grown to twice the size that they were in 1980, OIRA, the arm of OMB that's supposed to oversee regulations, has been halved. Regulatory agencies now have about 280,000 employees versus about 40 in OIRA. And OIRA only looks at a small percentage of the 3,000 to 4,000 regulations that we get each year. Between 2004 and 2014, they only looked at 8%, and they've only returned 1 regulation in the last 5 years. But even with those they do review, the record is not an encouraging one. In that same 10-year period, only 116 out of roughly 3,000 major rules had estimates of both benefits and costs, and many of those estimates were quite poor. So where OIRA was reasonably effective at the outset, the growing imbalance between OIRA and the agencies is producing these poor results. It is now David versus Godzilla. Take one example from a recent rule produced under the Food Safety and Modernization Act. The food industry estimated that it would cost more than $18 billion to comply with just one rule, the packaged food rule. Yet, in its analysis of that rule, FDA claimed not to have any idea whether or not it would make an impact on food safety. OIRA should have been in a position to stop this rule. This was a rule to reduce risk, and OIRA is at a disadvantage when they are reviewing risk-related rules. Assessing risk is an activity that virtually every American engages in every day, and they do so objectively. In agencies, Regulations are often based on formalized risk assessments to determine the baseline risk and the amount of risk that will be reduced by the regulation. If these assessments are inaccurate, then the benefits of the rule will be inaccurate. In fact, time and again, agencies overstate risk or the amount of risk reduced. So OIRA needs risk assessors to be able to review the analyses to make sure that benefits can be compared to costs. But OIRA has another role to play beyond reviewing regulations, ensuring that the public has enough information and time to adequately comment on the rules that often take years to develop, run to thousands of pages, some including very complex analysis. Typically, the public gets 60 to 90 days to respond, and that's insufficient. So what can help? First, I think to get better analysis, you can restore OIRA to its original size, which was about 90. In addition, ensure that OIRA has qualified risk assessors on staff. Second, you can codify the economic executive order that will make it much more enforceable. In terms of the public, it's important to let the public know what's coming and how to respond. The current system seems designed to inhibit public comment. To accomplish this, there are several things that can be done. First, have OIRA, in conjunction with GAO, enhance the unified agenda to make agencies include more information in proposals, which would include a statement of the problem, the legal basis, alternatives for solving the problem, and a preliminary discussion of the benefits and costs. For bigger rules, agencies should be required to publish an advance notice of proposed rulemaking with an expanded discussion of what's in the unified agenda. This will give the public, particularly small businesses, much more time to formulate a constructive, information-rich comment that clearly communicates and supports their claims, as the Federal Government asks them to do. OIRA should also be charged with making it easier to find out when a particular industry has to comply with various rules from different agencies. So, for example, an industry can get regulations from the IRS, from EPA, and from OSHA, and they can have different dates that are all running together. OIRA could create online calendars by industry that would list the compliance dates for various rules. In fact, OIRA could go further. They could coordinate with agencies to make sure that no industry is faced with bunched-up compliance dates. OIRA has a long and distinguished history in helping to solve social problems, but they are simply outgunned, as Congress has allowed this agency to dwindle in size and importance. But given the size and reach of the regulatory state, this is a much-needed check for the President to exercise some degree of control over the regulatory agencies. Thank you, and I welcome your comments.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Mr. Backens, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Conley, and members of the committee. At the outset, I just want to reiterate some of the testimony we've heard today and note that OIRA does play a critical role in our regulatory process. When you consider that 40 or 50 employees have to review the work of tens of thousands of regulators reviewing roughly 400 rulemakings annually, sometimes highly technical. It is a testament that we've had, I think, 6 administrations help to establish and advance the work of OIRA, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans to help advance the work of OIRA. With that said, there are obviously transparency and reporting concerns at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And if you take a look back at the last 20 or 30 years of regulatory reform, you'll find sometimes OIRA is very much at the center of those reform efforts, but all of them have transparency and reporting issues, and you can sort of just go down the litany, some of which has been well litigated in the past. Issues with the Unified Agenda, the Congressional Review Act, the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, the Information Collection Budget, which reports on cumulative paperwork totals as part of the Paperwork Reduction Act, OIRA reports to Congress, and implementation of Executive Orders 13563 and 13610. On the Unified Agenda, it's again well known that in 2012, there just, for some reason, wasn't a spring unified agenda for whatever reason. And to our knowledge, that's the only instance when there weren't 2 unified agendas published in a calendar year. With regard to the Congressional Review Act, there was a recent report from the Administrative Conference of the United States which found thousands of rulemakings that were never submitted to GAO as part of the CRA process, which would then, I guess in practice, could deprive Congress of its oversight ability under the CRA. Now, agencies do have a responsibility to submit rules to GAO under the CRA, but OIRA also has a responsibility to label rules as major under the CRA procedure as well. With regard to the information collection budget, I know that's a somewhat obscure report on paperwork, but it has been more than 500 days since our last update of the information collection budget. And finally, on implementation of Executive Orders 135, 63, and 13610, which were ostensibly designed to modify, streamline, expand, or repeal the existing regulatory state. We saw op-eds in the Wall Street Journal about moving to a 21st century regulatory system and streamlining and repealing redundant regulation. And if you actually look at the 400 to 500 rulemakings contained in these reports, you will find notable examples of rulemakings that do cut costs and paperwork. But from our account, they are often dwarfed by all the new rulemakings that, for example, implement the Affordable Care Act. And we sort of struggle to understand how implementation of the Affordable Care Act constitutes a retrospective review designed to streamline or eliminate red tape. And there are some other notable examples as well. Department of Education's gainful employment rule, which has billions of dollars in costs and millions of paperwork hours, is also included in these retrospective reports. In addition to the controversial Waters of the United States rule, which has found its way in EPA and DOD's section of the report, along with CAFE standards, the 2017 to 2025 CAFE standards. And by our account, the last report that was issued, if you include the regulatory costs and the regulatory cost-cutting measures, contains roughly $16 billion in costs and 6.5 million in new paperwork burden hours. And finally, an issue which I'm sure the committee is familiar with, of midnight regulation. This is something that Administration Lansky has already issued a memorandum to agencies sort of outlining the procedure for regulations during this presidential transition year. Similar memos were issued in 2008. Of course, that at the time, that did not stop sort of the flood of regulations that happened during that time. There's a lot of quantified evidence showing that flood of regulation. And just to give you an idea of how quickly things can run through the process with a willing executive, we found some Department of Energy regulations in 2000 and 2008 where the entire life of the rulemaking, from proposed rule to final publication in the Federal Register, was less than the comment periods for some notable regulations during the proposed cycle. So the entire history of rulemaking of just about 100 days. So finally, another issue, again related to the Congressional Review Act, is the carryover provision, which by our calculation and by the Congressional Research Service calculation, this year will be somewhere around mid to late May, which means that any regulation issued after that date, Congress and the next administration could review in 2017, which there is certainly an incentive for the administration to have sort of a mini rush in regulation during this spring so as to avoid any review under the CRA in 2017. We haven't seen any evidence of that so far, but that's something that we'll certainly be monitoring this spring going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Batkins. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. Mr. Shalansky, would you agree that part of the core mission of OIRA is to ensure that agencies analyze less burdensome means of fulfilling policy objectives?
One of the things that we ask agencies to do is to analyze regulatory alternatives when such are available.
And to analyze less burdensome ones, correct?
When there is a less burdensome alternative available, we ask them to.
Okay, well, as you may be aware, the Department of Labor has proposed a very complex fiduciary rule. You're familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Yet OIRA has not ensured that the Department of Labor has analyzed any less burdensome options to the currently proposed rule. In fact, the Department of Labor openly refused to do that. Openly refused to analyze any other options. Don't you see that as being a direct conflict to what the core mission of OIRA is?
Thank you, Congressman Carter. The rule is still under review at OIRA, and so we have an ongoing review on the conflict of interest rule, or the fiduciary rule, as you referred to. So that review is not yet complete, and I can assure you that all of the input, all of the public comment, all of the relevant issues are being seriously considered during that review, which is, as I
So
said,
before the Department of Labor implements this rule, you're telling me that it's got to be approved by OIRA?
the final rule is currently under review in my office. It has to, we have to complete that review before they can publish it in the Federal Register and implement it.
How long have you been reviewing this particular rule?
I'd have to check how long we've had it. We've had it for a good bit of time.
Good bit of time being...
Again, I would have to check exactly when it came in.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I'm clear on this now. So the fiduciary rule the Department of Labor is proposing, you have to approve it first before it can be published by the Department of Labor and become the rule, the law.
Yes, we have to conclude review on this final rule, just as we did on the proposed rule. So it's back with us for a second time, and they cannot publish the rule in the Federal Register until my office concludes review.
And again, I want to make sure I understand the core mission. The core mission of OIRA is to make sure that agencies are looking at less burdensome means for fulfilling policy objectives, right?
One of the elements of our core mission, as defined by the executive orders and relevant statutes, is to make sure the agency has analyzed and considered regulatory alternatives.
Well, this is certainly a case where we have asked the Department of Labor to look at some less burdensome rules. So we're depending on you to fulfill this core mission. Okay?
Understood, sir.
Understood. Okay. Let me ask you something. Have you received any instructions from the Department of Labor or the White House regarding any kind of timeline for the review of this particular fiduciary rule?
We clearly want to complete our review within a reasonable period.
That's not what I asked. Okay, I'm sorry. I'll try to be succinct. Have you been given any instructions from the Department of Labor or from the White House regarding a timeline for the review of this fiduciary rule? Yes or no?
No.
No, you have not. Have you received any kind of communication from the White House or from the Department of Labor regarding the importance of getting this fiduciary rule done as quickly as possible?
Yes, of course.
You have. Can you make that communication available to us, to this committee?
The communication comes in the form of a conversation sometimes, which is we're submitting.
Do you have anything in writing?
Probably not. No.
Probably not, but it comes in the form of communication. Mr. Chairman, how do we handle something like that? Because I'd be really interested in knowing what exactly has been communicated.
Well, certainly emails and other types of messages would have to be preserved. So is it
Yeah, I
the gentleman's testimony that there was none of that? It was all verbal?
Mr. Meadows, I would have to go back and check. I mean, these come in the form of conversations when we receive briefings on a rule. We'd really like to move this forward so that the industry has notice of what's coming, so that they will have the opportunity to plan their compliance with any rule. This is rather standard. I mean, I work in the White House, so it's rather normal that I would have conversations with other officials in the White House bearing on policy issues. So,
Okay, well, let me ask you this way then. Have you received any directions from the White House or from the Department of Labor to make this happen, to make this rule, to let this rule go through?
both the White House policy offices and the Department of Labor are absolutely aware that we must be left independently to review this rule. And I have received no order about any specific outcome from our review process. From
I'm going to ask you again, if you have anything in writing, will you please make that available to this committee?
I will go back and see what I have, and I will consult, but I would ask you to please route any such requests to our Legislative Affairs Office, and they will come back to me, and I endeavor to get you all the information you need.
Okay. Can I have one final one? Okay, one final question. Would you agree, Mr. Shalansky, that one of the core missions is to ensure that the agency addresses any concerns raised by other agencies?
Absolutely, that is a
So the SEC has raised the SEC has raised 26 concerns, 26, regarding the Department of Labor's fiduciary rule. Yet the Department of Labor rejected the majority of them. Have you, in OIRA, have you addressed any of these that have been raised by the SEC, or is that what you're doing now?
As I say, we have the rule under review. All concerns are being considered.
Including the concerns, 26 concerns by the SEC?
All of the substantial interagency concerns are dealt with during the review process.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think the gentleman from Virginia has been very kind to let the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Chaffetz, be recognized for a series of questions.
Thank you, Chairman, and I appreciate Mr. Conley. Thank you for your generosity and cooperation. Mr. Shalansky, I want to understand what you believe your duty and obligation is to respond when Congress sends you a letter, and specifically I'm talking about the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. I'm the chairman of this committee. I have sent you on the waters of the United States 2 letters and a subpoena, and yet we still have an incomplete document production. That subpoena was July of last year. What do you feel your duty and obligation is to respond when we send you a letter?
So first of all, let me say that I think the oversight function that this committee and all congressional committees perform are vitally important. And so I fully agree with and support and would endeavor to get you all the information you need for your lawful oversight functions. I believe that's a critical function. We do respond to all correspondence that we receive from Congress. We have a process that goes through, and it is my understanding that we have a very robust ongoing discussion between your staffs and your offices and the Legislative Affairs Office and General Counsel's Office at OMB to respond to your requests.
I don't want to have any more staff discussions. My question is, what duty do you believe you have to respond to us?
I believe it is my duty to turn over all documentation to our General Counsel's Office and our Legislative Affairs Office that is currently engaged in the process of producing documents and witnesses for you.
So in the case of WOTUS, the Waters of the United States, when is it reasonable for us to expect you to produce a full, complete, 100% document production? What's a reasonable time for your response?
Again, I am not personally involved with...
What do you mean you're not personally involved? You're in charge of this organization, so...
I am not personally involved with the process that has been ongoing for months between the General Counsel's Office of OMB and the Legislative Affairs Office.
So who do we call before this committee that will take accountability here? General Counsel? What's his name? Or her name?
Again, I do not have personal involvement with the negotiations that are ongoing.
Wait, we're not here to negotiate. Why should we? You gave us you said we have a valuable constitutional duty. Why should we have to negotiate what you're going to give to us?
My understanding is that there is a process in place, Mr. Chaffetz, by which you've received thousands of pages of documents.
No, most of those.
Witnesses for transcribed interviews. And all of my documents are turned over. Again, I'm not personally involved in the negotiations that you and your
Give me
office-
some names. Who are the people that are involved?
I would refer you to our Legislative Affairs Office.
No.
for all that
See, this is the
information.
runaround we get. I issued a subpoena in July of last year. Why shouldn't I hold somebody in contempt?
My understanding is that subpoena is in the process of being answered. You've already done one transcribed
I'm asking you what a
interview.
reasonable amount of time is to get a response.
Again, the process is ongoing.
7 months? Is that reasonable?
Again, I refer you to our Legislative Affairs Office that's managing
Give me
this
some
process.
names, Mr. Shalansky.
I'd be-
You saying you're not responsible, but you're the administrator of this office, so
Mr. Chaffetz, I'm responsible for turning over all of my documentation and getting you all the information to our General Counsel's office. They've been working with your offices for months. I'm not going to step outside of a robust, ongoing process.
So you don't believe that your responsibility is to respond to Congress. You believe your responsibility is to respond to an attorney at the White House.
I disagree with your characterization.
Well, I'm just trying to repeat what you just told me. You said your responsibility is to give it to the General Counsel.
I have turned over all of my documentation, everything that I have on that rule. They are in a robust process that has been going on with your office that you are participating in that is ongoing, that has led to a large document production.
It's not a
and
large.
ongoing document production and witnesses.
It is not a large. Most of what we have, the overwhelming majority, is publicly available documents. I can go to the internet and get it, just download it. What we've asked for is the list of people and the documents themselves. I'm asking a simple question. What is a reasonable amount of time for Congress to get that information?
My understanding is that this is a process that has been ongoing, that has been producing you documents. I've turned everything over that I have to the people
So
that are
you
working
believe
with
that
your
the General
offices.
Counsel has 100% of the documents?
The General Counsel has 100% of my documents. I'm only involved with my documents.
See, this
And I-
administration is just playing hide the documents. I'm trying to figure out how and where are these documents? And give me the name of the General Counsel.
I believe that your office is deeply involved with
No.
General Counsel's
Did you
office.
misunderstand my question? My question is, give me the name of the person.
I'm going to refer you to our Legislative Affairs Office.
Mr. Shalansky, you got to answer the question. Either you don't know or you have to answer the question.
You're under oath. Do you know that person's name?
Yes, I do.
Then what is his name?
It's a her.
What's her name?
Her name is Alana Cohen, as your staff well knows.
Well, I'm asking you the questions. Why do I have to spend 3 minutes trying to get you to give me a name?
Mr. Chaffetz, we have had a very robust back
You can
and
keep
forth.
using that word robust. I know you trained up on it. I asked you a simple question. I send you a subpoena. I send you letters. We shouldn't have to yank you up here.
And I gave you a very simple answer. I've turned over all of my documents to the people who are working closely with your office and producing those documents. 4,000 pages of documents, at least one transcribed interview, so I've heard, and more of them scheduled. There is an ongoing process, so I do not think it is a fair characterization that you have not received an answer.
Well, I expect to get 100% of the documents. So
100% of my documents are turned over. I am not personally involved.
turned over to, not to us.
To our Legislative Affairs Office and our General Counsel's office that is working with your office.
That's
to get
not
you what you
an
need.
acceptable answer. You're
Well, I'm-
failing in your duty to respond to Congress, and I quite frankly don't understand why we shouldn't hold you personally in contempt of Congress.
That's
I'll
certainly your
yield back.
prerogative, Mr. Chafee.
Yes, it is. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Conley, for a series of questions in a generous 5 minutes.
I thank the chair, and welcome to the panel. Let me begin, Ms. Sager, since '03, GAO's had 7 reports, I believe, on OIRA. Is that correct? With containing a total of 25 recommendations over the course of those 7 reports. You got to turn on your mic.
We focused on 7 reports in the written statement that had specific aspects of those reports, had recommendations to OMB, to OIRA, related to transparency.
And about 9 of those recommendations have been implemented to your satisfaction.
That's correct.
And why have 16 not been implemented?
In those cases, either OIRA disagreed with the recommendation, or there are some where they may have taken action, and we are still trying to get documentation to close the recommendations.
Mr. Shalansky, can you highlight for us the ones with which you disagree?
We have ongoing discussions with GAO. I would reiterate what Ms. Sager said. We have responded directly on a number where we have actually adopted the recommendations. There are several others where we are doing things that are very much in the spirit of the recommendation, but not the specific thing that GAO is doing, and I can give you an example there. An example would be, for example, on getting agencies to talk in their preambles about the basis for a significance determination. We haven't felt that a formal guidance is necessary, but we've encouraged agencies
All right.
to put that kind of information.
I think it would be useful if you could subsequently submit to the committee that status, because it sounds bad that 16 of 25 are not being implemented. Some of them are in progress. I think we'd like to know where you object and why with the remainder, just for our illumination, so it's not a transparency issue, it's a substantive issue. Going back to this issue of WOTUS, I guess the minority staff were under the impression that this would not become a WOTUS hearing, but since the issue came up, Mr. Shalansky, I wouldn't want to leave the impression that your office has been entirely uncooperative with this committee. Your staff came to meet with the committee staff on January 29th to discuss subpoena compliance. Is that correct?
Again, I'm not directly involved with the subpoena compliance beyond turning over.
Are you aware
documents.
of whether your staff meets with our staff or not?
I am aware there is a
Well,
process.
did they meet on the 29th of January
I
or
don't
not?
know if they met with you on the 29th of January, Mr. Connolly.
Okay. After that meeting, it's my understanding that your staff agreed to make rolling productions available on a monthly basis. Are you aware of that?
I want to make one clarification. The General Counsel of OMB is not my staff, and the Legislative Affairs Office of OMB are not my staff. Those are peer, separate offices with OMB. I do not direct their operations, so I think I need to clarify that. They handle these matters for the Office of Management and Budget. So in working with them, I am working through the normal process for subpoena compliance.
Mr. Shalansky, I have been a corporate officer in the private sector. I have been the chief elected officer in the public sector. I have run things. And even if something is handled by my legal department, if I'm in charge, I make it my business to know whether we're in compliance, especially if I know I'm going to be testifying before a committee. I'm actually trying to help you here, Mr. Shalansky, but you're wiping your hands of this and saying it's someone else's responsibility as if you have nothing to do with it, frankly plays into the hands of your critics.
Let me be very clear. I will happily, willingly, and eagerly do anything that I am advised to do, I am told to do, that your staffs and our staff agree constitute compliance with the subpoena.
Mr.
For that
Shalansky,
reason,
Mr. Shalansky, I'm actually trying to help you. It was left out there that you were uncooperative with this committee. I'm trying to establish for the record that there's another side to that story. You've, in fact, your office has produced 4,000 pages to this committee. Now, maybe that's not to the full satisfaction of somebody, or maybe they didn't find what they wanted. But it's not like you haven't been meeting with this committee and cooperating. But it's not helpful to me or you for you to wash your hands off it saying, well, I don't know anything about that.
No, here's what I know.
When you're under subpoena, how can the head of an office under subpoena tell this committee, I'm unaware of it? I don't know. Not my business.
That's not what I said, Mr. Connolly.
It
What I
comes
said
damn
was this.
close to what you said, Mr.
Well,
Shalansky.
then let me, if I may, I'd like to clarify. I am aware that we have a very serious process underway to comply. If we did not, I would be very concerned, and I would be going internally to say, what are we doing to comply? But something different is going on. I've turned over all of my documents, and I have been informed, and am regularly informed, not of a specific date that a meeting takes place, but that there are ongoing conversations and ongoing document productions to this committee. If that were not happening, I'd be gravely concerned. But not only that, every time I am told, we have a request for you to do X, I said, fine, tell me what to do. I'm ready to do what the process dictates. And this is a cooperative process, I have been led to believe, between the people on your committee and the people in the Office of
Yeah, how's that working out
Budget.
for you? You just heard how cooperative that is. But I can't help somebody who doesn't want to help cooperate. One final point, Dr. Williams, I found your testimony helpful in terms of specifics and how to improve the process, and thank you, and I expect nothing less from one of the outstanding universities in the world, George Mason University, which just so happens to be located in the 11th District of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly.
But thank you. I wish we had a little more time to explore, because I would like the opportunity to sort of work with you and Mr. Shalansky on how practical some of those suggestions might be, because I think you make then I'll end, but I think you make a really good point. How can we possibly expect Mr. Shalansky and his colleagues at OIRA to really fulfill their mission with only 40 people? When you're talking about this immense enterprise. And we can argue whether there should be more or less regulation, but whatever the number, it's still gargantuan, and one wonders whether just the sheer volume of it is something that we need to take a look at in terms of the role of OIRA. So I thank you for your testimony, and we're going to certainly follow up on that.
Great.
Thank you,
I will tell you, in my short time at OIRA, I found the job depressing because it is so overwhelming.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman from the 11th District of Virginia, home of George Mason. The chair recognizes a gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for a series of questions.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I probably will just use a minute or two here, but I wanted to follow up. I think it was about a year ago that Mr. Shalansky was in front of the committee, and we asked him a few questions, so I kind of want to go back there. But first of all, Mr. Shalansky, what exactly is the core mission of OIRA? What exactly do you do? Because agencies come up with rules that have to be put in place when laws are passed and legislation is done. Tell me exactly what OIRA does. So tell the committee what OIRA does.
When the agency has finished a rule, and it can be either a proposed rule or a final rule, they submit that rule to OIRA. If it's a rule that is determined to be significant, we bring it in for review. And we do two things when we have it in for review, two primary things. We circulate it to other federal agencies for their comments so that we get the interagency views so that there aren't conflicts or duplication amongst agencies or problems with jurisdiction. And the other thing we do is we look at the rule carefully to make sure it's grounded in the evidence, that it, if it's an economically significant rule, that has a good cost-benefit analysis with it.
Is your evaluation of the proposed rule, or maybe the final rule, is it focused on the substance of the rule and or Did the agency comply with notice, public comment, cost benefit? Is it all the above or just parts of that?
Certainly when it's a proposed rule that the agency is bringing forward for the first time, before it's had public notice and comment, we're very focused on the substance.
Okay.
And the reason we're focused on the substance is that rule is going to go out for public comment. It's going to be a notice of proposed rulemaking.
So it's a two-step thing. So you're going to look at the
two-step
substance first, then the agency's going to send it out for public comment, and notice it in public comment, and
Right.
get that feedback back. Then are you going to look to see if they actually complied with the process they're supposed to go through to make sure this rule is appropriate?
Yes, that's exactly what we do. So we look at the substance again when the rule comes back, because the agency will often make changes between the proposed version and the final version. But the other thing that's happened in that time is probably one of the hallmarks of the U.S. regulatory system. It's the public comment. And the important factor is the public comments are part of the administrative record. Those are documents that remain part of the record. So we make sure when an agency brings a final rule back to us of two things that tie very closely to process. One is that they do not ignore the substantive and important public comments that they've
Right.
received. And the second thing is that the actual rule that they put forward, the substance of that rule, logically follows from what the public had noticed might happen.
So it's a two-step, but my understanding is, is it accurate to summarize, it's a two-step process. Step one, look at the substance. Step two, make sure that when it's an important rule, they're going through the proper notification, proper public comment, proper notice, and everything else.
Both of those factor in, yes.
Okay, so the GAO issues a report a few years ago, late 2012, December 2012. What GAO found, very first sentence, agencies did not publish a notice of proposed rulemaking, enabling the public to comment on a proposed rule for about 35% of major rules and about 44% of non-major rules published in about a 10-year time frame, 8-year time frame prior to that. Do you know anything about that? Because that would sound like it just went contrary to what you just described.
So this relates to a particular kind of rule, if I'm recalling correctly, the GAO report. Agencies under the Administrative Procedure Act are allowed to do some rules directly to final, and that is permissible under some circumstances.
So directly to final, what part of this if an agency goes directly to final, what part of that two-step process that you just described did they do an in-run around?
So this is
Both
where-
parts?
No. So
Just the second part?
and that's what GAO was concerned about, is sometimes they did not do the second step.
Okay, and do you have to sign off on that?
No, what we have to sign off on.
Did you make an issue of it?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, then why did it happen 35% of the time for major rules?
Yeah, so one of the things we've been trying to do since the time that report was issued was to get agencies to commit ahead of time when they are legally able to do what's called an interim final rule, to make sure it's truly interim and that they in fact do then put the rule out for public comment and finalize the rule in light of that public
If GAO would do a study now, what percentage of major rules are not following the notice and public comment process?
I would hope it's a greatly reduced number. I don't know what the number would be. I don't think it's a common occurrence.
Are you actively, are you cataloging that? I mean, does OIRA know when an agency is not going to follow notice and public comment for, I'm using the GAO's descriptive word here, major rules? Do you know that?
So the number of interim final rules that fall into this category, I think is to begin with a rather small number. What fraction don't then go through the comment period, I don't know. We've been working very hard
Well,
to
we'd
get
like to
agencies-
know that. It seems like if you're the folks who oversee how the rules are done and making sure they're supposed to be done right. If 35% of the time major rules aren't going through the notice and public comment process, we need to know that. So if you could get that information and get it to us, that'd be helpful.
And just to clarify for the record, it's not 35% of all major rules. It's 35%, I think at the time, of this particular category of regulations, if I'm...
That's not what the sentence says.
Yeah, I would have
It
to...
says for about 35% of major rules and about 44% of non-major rules.
Well, I will certainly go back and look, and I think you're absolutely right. This is an area that if those numbers remain anything close to what they are, we need to do more on.
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I said 2 minutes in here, I'm taking 6, so I appreciate the indulgence. For the fact that And this would seem to be something that you would be jumping and kicking and screaming and, making all kinds of noise about, that 35% of the time they're not doing what they're supposed to do, and it's the very thing that OIRA was created to make sure they did.
Right, and so since I have been in office in 2013.
And more importantly, sorry to interrupt, but more importantly, you can't tell me what that percentage is now. We know it was 35% for a significant time frame when this report came out. We don't know what that is now. We don't know if it's higher, lower. We don't know.
I would hope that it's significantly lower. It's not something.
But we don't want to go on your hope. We want you to give us the information. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes himself for a series of questions. So let me follow up on one point. Mr. Shalansky, you just said that you review the public comment. You were telling Mr. Jordan you review the public comment.
We don't read all of the public comments ourselves. What we do is we make sure that the agencies have.
So what percentage of the public comments do you review?
Well, the agencies submit to us what's called a response to comment as part of these rules.
So you don't actually review public comment?
We review an awful lot of them. I mean, sometimes there are millions of them that are.
Well, the reason why I ask is because we've had, a transcribed interview where someone under oath said, and I quote, "We don't get involved in the review of public comments." So how do you reconcile your testimony with sworn transcript?
Well, it's exactly what I just said. We make sure that the agencies have responded to public comment. That's what we do. But there is a form of.
But that's not what you said. So what you're telling me is you don't review public comment. Is that correct?
It is not.
You just make sure they review public comment.
And more than just review it. They can't just say, we've reviewed it. They
So
have.
how do you determine that?
We read in the document they submit to us as part of a final rule package what their response to the comments are.
So they do a response to the comment. So what you're doing is reviewing their response to public comment,
They
not
produce-
reviewing public comment.
They produce a summary of public comment, and they show what their responses are, and we review to make sure that they weighed in. And I would add that one of the very important functions that we do when we have a rule under review is we meet with the public. We're required to under the executive.
What percentage of the public?
Well, in the last 2 years, we've had 900 meetings with stakeholders, 900.
And that would represent what percentage?
Of the interested parties, since we take any meeting that anybody requests, it's, I presume.
So you'll meet with 100% of the people that ask you?
We do not turn down meeting requests. We have accepted.
So your testimony is you meet with 100% of the people that ask. How do you do that with a staff of 45 people?
Like I say, we've had 900 meetings in the last 2 years.
Okay, the ranking member was trying to help you out, Mr. Shalansky, because honestly, some of your testimony is incongruent. And so I'll put it that way because it seems to be conflicting. At your previous hearing, we talked about resources. Dr. Williams has talked about how, it's just overburdened, yet you said that you were adequately resourced in the previous hearing. So is your perceived, and I will use that word gently, perceived lack of complying to the subpoena a resource issue?
Again, I want to clarify that I fully wish to comply with every.
But you're not.
I
if your testimony is, because on the January 29th meeting that he talked about, where you actually came in and talked about subpoena compliance with staff, actually you provided a few rolling document productions, but the other part of what you agreed to do during that meeting has not been done.
Can I clarify that I was not part of that meeting? When you say you.
Yeah, you can,
Yes,
your
I just want to
agency,
clarify.
okay.
That office.
Your name's on the subpoena.
I understand that. Which
And
is
so
why I have turned-
ultimately, if someone is not complying with the subpoena, it is not the general counsel, it's not your staff, it's you because your name's on the subpoena.
And
I'm trying to help you out here.
let me just say, I hope that I am fully complying with the subpoena. I intend to fully comply with the subpoena. I would never do anything but fully comply with a subpoena from this office. I want to make that very clear.
But that's not been your testimony today because you've referred to the general counsel. You said it's up to the general counsel to determine. And yet their name's not on the subpoena.
That's actually what I said was, my understanding was I want to be very clear about this. My understanding was there's an ongoing process to reply to the subpoena and to comply with the subpoena. I have turned over everything I have into that process For all I know, you have all of it. So it's really hard for me to know what more I can do here.
All right, so your testimony is you've turned it all over to general counsel, every one of your documents, and it is your belief today that they have turned all of that over to this committee.
It is my
That's
belief-
your, in preparing for this hearing, that's what you were told.
No, what I was told was there is ongoing discussion and turning over of
You know,
documents.
ongoing is a long word. It's not, it doesn't quantify when it's going to get, there are ongoing processes to try to balance our budget. It doesn't mean that it's getting done.
Well, all I can say is that it has been my wish and my request that the subpoena be fully complied with. I've turned over all of my documents, and I will.
What about the scope and the parameters of what you're even looking to provide to this committee? We've asked you for that, and yet you haven't provided that scope and what we're looking at. We've asked for custodians. We've gotten very little information. Those would seem to be the easy answers that the ranking member and I could get within 24 hours of you going back and saying, we need to let the committee know the scope of what we're looking at and the custodians who are charged with it and who all's involved. And we've been getting information that you haven't even reached out to them.
It is my understanding that every effort has been made to obtain the information you have requested. I certainly have turned over everything I have and that it is in my power to turn over.
All right, let me put it this way. You are in charge. It is the opinion of some that you are not being compliant with providing information to this committee. I will be tenacious until we actually get your compliance. And I want to make sure I'm clear here because some of my questions from a year ago and the responses you gave me are not, I guess I didn't articulate them properly because the answers you gave me are not bared out with fact. Does that make sense?
Since I don't know what you're referring
Well,
to, I can't
so
comment.
let me share with you just one exchange, and this is one of 3 that we have, but I'll share with you. When we were talking about the informal review process and the fact that there may be some dialogue that goes on between you and an agency. Now, that particular one, we were talking about WOTUS, but today I'm talking about any of them, not just the WOTUS ruling. And I said, basically, we've had a number of hearings here in this committee on the waters of the USA, on the proposed rule, and I believe that your testimony here today is that it has not been officially submitted to you. Is that correct? And you said, yes, that's correct. And so you've had no dialogue with them, is what I asked. And you said, I've had no dialogue with the EPA. And I went on further. I said, informal or formal. I've had no dialogue whatsoever with the EPA on the waters of the USA. Okay, how about deliberations, I asked. And you said, well, no deliberations, no discussions. So in follow-up to Mr. Carter's response today, so I asked, so if I were to ask you for all of your records, and so I assume that you've turned over all your records to general counsel, so if I were to ask you for all of your records, would we find 0 records, 0 emails, nothing with the EPA with regards to the rulemaking on the proposed rule? Your response was, we concluded review on the proposed rule. The EPA took it from there. The next I will hear about is when they submit the final rule. Now, you actually changed that to say that you actually hadn't had the formal rule at that particular time because you came back and corrected that. But here's my concern, is the committee has emails where actually the administrator has had direct communication with OIRA, and there were lines that were marked out and edited for the proposed rule. So that's my concern. You're saying there's nothing, and yet we have evidence that there was something.
I think it's important to draw a very clear distinction here. Of course I had discussions and interaction with...
But that was not your testimony.
Sir,
I mean, I couldn't have been much clearer. I said informal or formal.
I need to finish my answer because
This
is vitally important.
It is.
When we had the proposed rule under review, formally submitted, I of course had correspondence with the EPA and interactions, and I would expect that you have those documents. When the agency had the proposed rule back in, and we had concluded review on the proposed rule, I don't think I had any correspondence or interaction or discussion with the
So you're
EPA.
doubling down that you never have discussion with an agency informally before it goes into the formal process.
Are we talking about WOTUS, or are we talking about
You know, it's
occasion-
your agency. Let me just tell you, I'm trying to make it clear. Ms. Sager, do they, in your GAO report, seem to indicate that there's this informal review process that sometimes goes back and forth with agency? Can you eliminate that any?
There are conversations between OIRA and the agencies about the nature of proposed rules, yes.
So how do you reconcile what the GAO is telling me with your testimony here, Mr. Shalansky?
Well, Mr. Meadows, you've moved back and forth between the specific case of...
No, sir. I
You
think
have.
I've been, well, let me just tell you, it's not my agency, so please enlighten me, because let me tell you, what it smells like here is that you're not being truthful with this committee.
So let me separate two things and be very plain about it. My answer on WOTUS was correct. I had no interaction with WOTUS between the proposed and final rule with the EPA on the Clean Water Rule. Are there occasions, as Ms. Sager said, when agencies come and brief us on rules that they have not yet formally submitted? Yes, there are. And I've said that before in testimony.
But in my direct questioning, I was trying to get to that very exact point, and you gave an answer that was not.
But I realize that now. Last time we had the occasion to speak about the issue, Mr. Meadows, I was not clear on whether you were asking about proposed rules or talking about separately as informal rules, because we don't have a category that we keep of informal review. Okay, what we do is sometimes an agency will say, we're developing a rule, or we have a rule we're going to submit in 2 months. We'd like to come in and brief you about it. We do have those discussions, as Ms. Sager said, but we don't have the rule at that point. We're not actually reading the rule, and we're not involved in helping them develop the rule. We're getting briefed.
All right,
on the
but let me
scope of
interrupt
the
you.
rule.
If you're having discussions with them, how could that not be helping them develop the rule? Why are you having the discussion? Is it what you have for breakfast?
No, it's more.
If you're not helping them, how do you have a discussion if you're not helping them develop the rule?
So they're going to want to know what we will expect from them when the review process starts.
That's helping them develop the rule.
Okay. I mean, we're not making policy decisions for them. They'll come to us and say, we have a rule on a particular topic. Here's the direction the rule is going, often with not terribly much specificity. And we'll tell them, okay, we're going to need certain kinds of analysis. We're going to need certain things to be an element of the rule package. But it would not be the proper role of OIRA, for example, to tell HUD what their policy decisions should be in a particular rule.
That's not what I was asking. The problem is your testimony today is in direct conflict with the testimony you gave just about a year ago, because this was the exact line of questioning that I was trying to get to. And either it was my inability to articulate it properly or your inability to comprehend it properly, but somehow we miscommunicated. And what I'm concerned about is it took other witnesses here for you to finally agree to what we already knew.
Well, Mr. Meadows, I was not certain 5 minutes ago whether you were talking about a particular rule or generally. And I
Well,
hope I've made...
they have called votes, and so Dr. Williams, Mr. Backens, you both gave some very good, as my good friend Mr. Conley has indicated, some good analysis. What we would love to do is follow up, but so we don't keep you here any longer, we will submit some questions for that. I recognize the ranking member for a closing statement.
I thank the chair. I guess I would just say, Harry Truman used to have a sign on his desk, "The buck stops here." It was an acknowledgement that there had to be some ultimate authority where decisions got made and responsibility taken. I don't doubt Mr. Shalansky's commitment to his mission, and he has a long and distinguished career. But what is untenable is to assert that even though I'm the head of an agency, I have outsourced responsibility for compliance with a subpoena and the overall relationship with the committee to somebody else, and my only job is to hand over the raw documents, and I'm done. I don't take responsibility for dates, for meetings, for what information, if any, is provided, and whether or not we're in fact in compliance with a subpoena. That's not a tenable position. And I can assure you, on a bipartisan basis, that's going to be the point of view in this committee. And so I urge Mr. Shalansky to think about that, because I think we could avoid some problems by the taking of responsibility and by more awareness by Mr. Shalansky of, in fact, what meetings take place, who's at them, and what got agreed to, even if he isn't in that meeting. And I just respectfully submit that to the gentleman in question, because I think you're going to have real problems in this committee. And we already have a philosophical divide about the value and role of regulation, but to be eclipsed in that philosophical debate by an administrative burden or hurdle that is not defensible makes no sense to me. But that's just me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for his eloquent remarks. Mr. Shalansky, maybe what we can do is from this point forward, believe that you're going to comply with the subpoena and all the documents, and that we set the scope of when that would be, along with timetables and how we're going to do that. That's what we'll look for. Additionally, what I would ask with regards to the GAO recommendations, which GAO recommendations that you plan not to implement, the ones that you do plan to implement, and at what timetable are we going to look at that? I'm going to check. I'll follow up. I promise you I will follow up on that. And then Mr. Batkins and Dr. Williams, my apologies for not getting any further questions with you, but we will submit some for the record and ask you to respond back to this committee, and we appreciate your interest in this very valuable topic. And if there's no further business before the committee stands adjourned.